Hi, everyone. My name is Hanako Wakatsuki, and I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka National Historic Site. Thank you for joining our Week 8 book club on Farewell to Manzanar, written by my great aunt Jeannie and Uncle Jim. I am pleased to be able to feature my personal family story in this program. We will be hearing from Mika Kennedy on this important book that shaped Asian American literature. Mika Kennedy is a visiting assistant professor at Kalamazoo College, where she teaches courses about American literature, social justice, and the environment. Her current academic book project examines narratives of Japanese American incarceration and the ways these narratives are in conversation with questions about the environment, the seduction of the frontier, and Native sovereignty. She is also a co-curator of the JCL Detroit chapter's community history exhibit, Exiled in Motown, which explores the history of the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit. Without further ado, let's hear from Mika.
Hi, thanks so much for the introduction, Hanako. I'm really excited to talk to you today about Farewell to Manzanar. Farewell to Manzanar is probably the most well-known book about Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And if you've joined us today, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you've heard of it if you haven't already read it. It's often thought of as a young adult book, both because its protagonist is a young girl and because these days it can often be found in school curricula. So what I wanted to talk about today is its role in narrating the camp experience. And what I've done is outline 5 quick snapshots that will help us deepen our interactions with the story that Farewell to Manzanar tells. So first, we'll refresh our knowledge of the book itself, both in terms of its plot as well as the goals its authors had for it. Then we'll learn about its readers, what people thought when it was first published in the mid-70s, and how it has circulated to become this most well-known book in the decades that have followed. Then we're going to shift gears and really get into the text itself. We'll take a deep dive into one of the book's iconic scenes and investigate the way Farewell to Manzanar talks about how the pressure to assimilate continued to affect the JA community even after the camps had closed. And to wrap up, we'll talk about 2 interrelated things. What role writing and literature have to play when it comes to thinking through the incarceration, and what we as readers can do to keep that conversation going in 2020. So without further ado, let's get started. Farewell to Manzanar takes place in what is now a pretty familiar approach to narratives of the incarceration. So it's a memoir told from the point of view of a young Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston, who co-wrote the book with her husband, James D. Houston. And it follows young Jeanne and her family from her home on Terminal Island to the Assembly Center and to Manzanar, as well as documenting her family's return from camp. Now, some of you might be very familiar with where Manzanar is, but if you're not, I wanted to point it out on this map here. It's where that gold star is. And what always stands out to me is it's actually a lot further north than you might expect. It looks almost closer to Merced or Fresno than LA, the city its history is so closely intertwined with. But the thing is, there aren't direct inroads from the NorCal side. You hit the Sierras if you try to come from that direction. So taking that into account, as well as this visible different distance from LA, it's quite remote from anything. When Wakatsuki Houston and her husband started doing research for this book, this history also felt super remote. This was the 60s, 70s, and there'd been things published, but they found that it was mostly academic work, and while there'd been other novels and stories published as well, it still felt like a niche experience. The story wasn't front and center in the minds of many. So what they wanted to contribute was a version of events that was as accessible as possible, one that people wouldn't need to find in the archives or study in grad school. What Farewell to Manzanar ends up coming out of is a blend of this research they conducted, as well as Wakatsuki Houston's own memories from girlhood and the recollections of various family members, all in this big amalgamation. In a 1984 interview, Wakatsuki Houston calls this amalgamation a nonfiction novel because it's about true events and real personal experiences, but it's told in this very novelistic way with characters and story arcs and plot moments. There are also portions being recreated from research or narratives brought to life by piecing together the memories of others. So it's not just straight memoir from Wakatsuki Houston's personal perspective. The most concrete examples of this are the chapters that are written in italics. These were written by James D. Houston from the point of view of characters who aren't Jeanne, of events she wasn't present to witness. Her father's interview as a prisoner at Fort Lincoln, her brother-in-law in the military, and Woody's visit to Japan in 1946 in the wake of the atomic bombings. And that's him on the right there, a personal photograph. The caption says, "Goofing off." So here we have this memoir, which documents and imagines a moment in history that at the time it was published, most people really didn't know much about. But this was changing. When Farewell to Manzanar was published in 1973, the United States was in the midst of a paradigm shift. We're talking about the civil rights and Black Power movements, protests against the Vietnam War, protests against racial and economic injustice, as well as the Third World Liberation Front, which was a student movement that began in California and rapidly exploded nationwide. With an eye to all of the national organizing I just mentioned, one of the Third World Liberation Front's main demands was that they wanted universities to teach ethnic studies. And very specifically, they wanted universities to teach ethnic studies because they saw these narratives as essential to understanding what was going on in their world and to fighting the injustices they saw, whether it was people being moved out of neighborhoods or off their lands, or soldiers at war overseas. In this context, Farewell to Manzanar wasn't just published as a book about a thing that happened. It was a book about an experience that continues to be interconnected with what people saw happening. If we look at the way the book continues to circulate today, I think we can still feel that too. Like, take a look at these book covers. They might be a little small for you to pick out details, but even at a glance, the first thing that probably stands out is that there's a lot of them. And this isn't even all of them. What all these book covers tells us is that Farewell to Manzanar has been reprinted many, many times. It wasn't just that first run in 1973, and boom, that's all the Farewell to Manzanars the world needs. No, we kept printing more. And since 1973, all number of high schools and colleges and city reading programs have brought the book into their curricula. And not just in California or in places with a lot of JAs. A few years ago, the state of Missouri's Read More program chose Farewell to Manzanar as their focus text. But the largest mass adoption of Farewell to Manzanar as like a group's shared reading text was a massive curriculum that was developed for 8,500 California schools and 1,500 public libraries. This was in 2002. So let's think for a moment. What happened towards the end of 2001 that might have played a role in this renewed need for Farewell to Manzanar and this desire to use it to make connections across shared histories? Now I'm going to ask you to hold on to that, and we're going to come back to it at the end of this talk. But for now, let's take a step back and look at how people were talking about this book before it became such a quintessential narrative. Recall that one of the author's goals in writing this book was to offer an accessible account of the incarceration. When you succeed in such a goal, your book ends up in the hands of a lot of different readers. And I think it's really valuable to think about that range of readers, because even if we're living in the same world, we're not all experiencing it in the same way. So, for example, in 1973, when Farewell to Manzanar had just come out, there was a review of it in the New Yorker that was essentially a historical summary of what happened. And the review was probably written for an audience that may not have known about the camps at all. And then, on the other hand, you had a review in Gidra, which was a radical Asian American magazine that had come out of work being done by the Third World Liberation Front, and was mostly being written by young JAs in LA. As you might imagine, that review didn't come to the story with a, "Oh, did you know this happened?" perspective. That review was actually pretty scathing and unusual for that fact, but that reviewer didn't think that the book went far enough in its critique of the incarceration or didn't get political enough. And let me be clear, as a literary scholar, it's not my job to tell you whose opinion of the book is the most legitimate. If these reviews tell us anything, it's that we always need more than one book. And if Farewell to Manzanar is the one book everybody knows, it also paved the way for a cornucopia of narratives that we enjoy today. If Farewell to Manzanar was not the radical text that the Gidra reviewer needed it to be, it is a text that offered a very different perspective on the incarceration than what the mainstream had known before. Because remember, the official federal government story was that the camps were non-ideal, but were supposed to be an opportunity for Japanese Americans to prove their loyalty and good citizenship through answering the loyalty questionnaire affirmatively or through being good prisoners, etc. Well, Wakatsuki Houston said that she didn't want to write about quote-unquote super Americans. Instead, Farewell to Manzanar shifts focus to the trauma that the incarceration wrought, and the ways that trauma manifested even after the war was over and the camps were closed. Throughout this memoir, this trauma manifests in many ways. But because I mentioned this idea of super Americans, and we've been talking about the energy around teaching and learning about ethnic studies, the manifestation I want to focus on right now is the way Farewell to Manzanar narrates the struggle to contend with assimilationist pressures. In the book, the struggle gets highlighted both by the fact of the incarceration, as well as the fact that the narrator Jeanne is a schoolgirl. She wants to fit in, make friends, be accepted by her peers. So what we're going to do now is get up close and personal with one specific scene from Farewell to Manzanar, and think about how it's put together as a piece of writing to address this pressure to assimilate. The scene comes from the second half of the book, after the Wakatsuki family has returned from camp and is trying to resettle into life outside barbed wire once again. Jeanne has made some friends, but is also continually faced with this feeling of being less than and less than welcome. So she decides to enter into a school pageant. She intimates, "I knew I couldn't beat out the other contestants at their own game, that is, look like a bobby soxer. Yet neither could I look too Japanesey. I decided to go exotic, with a flower print sarong, black hair loose, and a hibiscus flower behind my ear." Now you may be thinking, "But Mika, I thought we were going to talk about assimilation and super Americans. Going for exotic isn't assimilating." And you're right, kind of. But what this points to really is that, like so many things, assimilation is more complicated than an either-or situation. She knows she'll never be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed belle, so she aims to win her peers over with exotica, to lean into her otherness. There's a lot we can talk about to address the idea that a generic Polynesian look ends up being the way Jeanne performs, being other but palatable and familiar. But for the sake of time, let's think about the image. A young Jeanne, bright flower sarong, loose hair, hibiscus. She doesn't choose this dress as cultural regalia. She chooses it because it's exactly what an exotic pinup girl looks like. She knows she can't ever look like a bobby soxer, whatever that is, but she can conform to a specific white fantasy. And at the end of the day, conforming to that fantasy is just another way of being a super American. And boy, it works. The passage continues, "When I walked barefooted out onto the varnished gymnasium floor, it sounded like some winning basket had just been made in the game against our oldest rivals." Close your eyes and imagine the cheers. She's in the school gym, and the applause is just echoing off the walls. when she says it sounded like some winning basket had just been made in the game against our oldest rivals. It's a metaphor that's appropriate to the situation. The scene takes place in a school gym, but it's more than that, right? Because who are those oldest rivals? For the sake of the metaphor, it's some high school basketball team, but in the context of the full scene, the pageant, it's more than that. Because think about what she wants in this scene. She doesn't want to get with these guys or even really to win the pageant. She wants to be welcomed. And at the time, a Japanese American's biggest rival in that fight was the gold standard of whiteness. Here she thought she'd found a way to dunk on white supremacy. But that feeling of victory is short-lived. Her father is furious, and it's difficult for Jeanne to parse out what of his fury is the patriarchy and what of it is a reaction against conforming to white fantasies and a condemnation of them. While Jeanne feels that initial triumph in her performance, we also see the painful backstage, and we follow Jeanne's perspective through that. It's hard and messy, and it is also absolutely necessary. What this scene points to is the fact that as the book portrays this very personal struggle, it's not just about Jeanne's life. It's about assimilationist pressures in their many forms. It's about hierarchies that privilege whiteness and exclude or exotify others. It's about the fact that it's never just a high school beauty contest. What this scene shows is that the personal is political. Not in the binary partisan sense, but in the sense that it directly concerns the government and public affairs of a country. And what this narrative emphasizes is that doing this work is really, really hard, conceptually, emotionally. Through Jeanne, we see that embodied. Wakatsuki Houston and her husband have noted that the title Farewell to Manzanar refers not so much to the physical place of Manzanar, but to the state of mind that it engendered. And really, what this pageant scene in the second half of the book shows is that you don't just flip a switch after the war is over and move on. Manzanar wasn't this one-off experience that can be wholly attributed to war hysteria. Its causes and effects extend beyond that. Scenes like the one we just read together and literature as a whole allow for narratives that can begin to capture that reality. I want to share a concept that comes from Mirashima Bukuro. She calls it writing to redress, and she writes, "Much writing from camp can be seen as the codification of a desire to set right what is wrong, or to relieve one's suffering from the psychological and physical imposition of forced relocation and incarceration." Basically, what that means is that writing about camp isn't just about explaining what happened. It's also very actively about seeking relief from trauma. It's about the act of saying farewell, not to forget it or erase it, but to create new relation to it. And this week, the Tadaima programming has been focusing a lot on the redress movement. So I'll try not to summarize too much of the recent presentations, but I did want to share this additional keyword with you, writing to redress, as a way of linking Farewell to Manzanar and other camp writing thematically to the broader redress movement, and to really emphasize the idea that writing isn't a passive account of something that happened. It's a way of coming to terms with it, and specifically coming to terms by also engaging a reading public in a way that says, hey, this still needs to be worked through. This is still an active presence in our world, and this reckoning is for everyone. So where do we go from here? Describing the Manzanar mentality, Wakatsuki Houston writes, "You cannot deport 110,000 people unless you have stopped seeing individuals. Of course, for such a thing to happen, there has to be a kind of acquiescence on the part of the victims, some submerged belief that this treatment is deserved, or at least allowable. It's an attitude easy for non-whites to acquire in America. I had inherited it. Manzanar had confirmed it." I think there's a way of coming away from this quote and equating a Manzanar mentality with victim blaming, where like the fault lies with those incarcerated rather than those who did the incarcerating. But if you think about the quote in context, that's not really what it's getting at. Instead, here are the questions that arise for readers. If it's an attitude easy for non-whites to acquire in America, why is that so? What is it in response to? Sometimes these structural racisms can be so baked in, it's difficult to see them for what they are. For instance, when we realize that the exotic is a form of assimilation to white ideals, even if it seems opposite to whiteness. But if living through Manzanar felt like a confirmation of non-belonging, undesirability, and shame, it also made very concrete the structures that go into creating and assigning those feelings. They manifest as camp. In writing Farewell to Manzanar as an accessible narrative of the incarceration, it becomes at once a personal way of redressing trauma, as well as a public way of naming the structures that create that trauma. I mentioned earlier California's big curricular movement, bringing Farewell to Manzanar to all those schools and all those libraries in 2002, in the wake, as you likely surmised, of 9/11. Today, we continue to think with these stories as we reckon with travel bans directed at people from Muslim-majority countries, family separation and incarceration at the border, and mass incarceration and policing across the US. The image on screen is a still from the 2020 Manzanar virtual pilgrimage of a little girl holding an illustrated sign at a recent protest that says, "We already did this." It shows an image of Geronimo, who was imprisoned at Fort Sill in the 19th century, a Japanese American imprisoned in camp in the 20th, and a casket and casket bearers in reference to death while in immigration detention in the 21st. If I were to name a takeaway from Farewell to Manzanar, among the many that exist, perhaps it's this. Personal stories can have intense political power, and this potential lies at the fundamental core of them. To read them is not simply to learn about a sad thing that happened to someone. It's about actively engaging with what that story meant and continues to mean, in order to internalize it in terms of how it guides our thinking, and to externalize it in the work we do to affect the society we want to be a part of. Although I'm a scholar of Asian American literature and my research focuses specifically on Japanese American incarceration, prior to this summer, I hadn't actually read Farewell to Manzanar since it was assigned to me in high school. But if my high school reading notes are anything to go by, it's a different book with every reread. So if you've already read it, I invite you to revisit it again sometime soon with the contemporary moment in mind, because it's always a different book. Thanks so much for listening. We're going to transition into our live Q&A, so I look forward to talking with you some more.
Hey, thank you so much, Mika, for the presentation. That was awesome. I see that you're still on mute, so I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. But one of the first questions that I just had for you is, what brought you into this line of work, as a literary scholar?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a confusing and muddled story, but I can say that this particular project and this particular subject matter that I've been researching for the last 7 years as part of my PhD program really came about as an undergraduate at UC San Diego. So at the time, I wasn't studying Japanese American history or Japanese American incarceration or literature at all in any formal sense. And my degree was actually in literature in English and Russian and Soviet studies. But at the same time, I was a student doing a lot of organizing with the Nikkei Student Union, which is the union of Japanese American students, and was one of the people who would direct the Day of Remembrance programming at UC San Diego and in the San Diego area, and lead pilgrimages to Manzanar for students at the university. And I was also at the time doing research for a professor about kind of native lands and native sovereignty. And I was really struck by the Owens Valley Paiute who would come to Manzanar for the pilgrimages. And it made me think a lot about those intersections and the way that Manzanar has so many different histories layered on top of it, and so many that are in direct kind of relation with one another. And that's really how I got more deeply into studying Japanese American incarceration in an academic sense, and trying to continually build those boundaries and also bring them into kind of public and community work as well.
Cool. So another question, like I really liked how you kind of brought within the presentation, like kind of a deeper dive into some of those quotes. Like I've read this book mostly when I was a child because it's part of our coming of age of like, hey guys, hey kids, you need to learn your family history, read the book, right? But you know, like what you're saying, that you know through the different lenses, you kind of catch different things. So I now realize I probably need to reread it more as an adult because I think the last time I actually did a book on tape, and that was probably a decade ago. But yeah, so that was really cool to kind of see. But you mentioned that you read it when you were in high school and then also again recently. So was there a character that you identified more so when you were in high school versus, you know, today, or not today, but like whenever you last read it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so prior to putting together the presentation for today, I actually went back and tried to find my old notes from high school about what I was thinking about with regard to Farewell and Manzanar. Needless to say, my notes are not great as someone who is in high school, but they were very revealing in that I definitely kind of attached myself to Jeanne and was definitely sort of all on board with seeing things through her perspective and kind of going through her experiences with her. And for much of the book, she is an 8-year-old narrator and goes into being kind of a high school student, which is relatable to me as a high school girl at the time as well. But I think coming back to it, I know the same teacher who assigned this book to read in class also made a point of continually telling us that we should come back to certain narratives as we get older and see how they're different. So shout out to Mr. Perlman at Washington High School in Fremont, California. And I think definitely Farewell to Manzanar is 100% one of those books. Because I know, having done some research now on this book, a lot of the people who have read it have been very compelled, not only by Jeanne's narrative, but also of the way that she portrays her father and the very complicated relationship that she, as a young girl, has with her father, who is taken to Fort Lincoln in North Dakota and imprisoned there and is kind of cut off from his family for a very long time, and ends up really struggling with the traumas that of his wartime experience, and that ends up being kind of a struggle that the family then goes to when they're ultimately reunited. And I think reading it now, that element to the book stands out a lot more to me than it did when I was younger and kind of reading it from the perspective of the young girl, because you can kind of, you feel a little bit more of her father's side of the story as you grow up, I think.
Yeah. Another question that I have before we start going to some of the public questions is that, you know, how there's always like books that get adapted to TV, right? Or movies and whatnot. And Farewell to Manzanar is one of those where they did have to actually change some of the characters' names. And I think that there's some other issues kind of going on there, but then also broadening it out to kind of meet the mainstream media aspects and whatnot. Like, I don't know, have you seen Farewell to Manzanar, the film?
I saw it in class in high school as part of our kind of reading of the book, but I haven't seen it since.
Okay. So maybe you can't answer this question, but it's like, I guess since you're into literature and all that, like, what do you think about like movies that were made out of books, and then how, you know, sometimes the quality is lost in that during this translation, but whatever you remember from way back then, do you think that it still held to the same, I guess, quality of the book narrative of trying to just get the history across? Was it effective, or was it like, good try, guys?
I think I'm a big fan of adaptation in general, because I think there's something just really magical and really wonderful about the invention of trying to move something from one medium into the next, and to think about the different sorts of narratives that each is most equipped to tell and what sorts of conventions to keep in mind, to say nothing of just all of the different bits and pieces that go into developing something as a movie or a television program, and all the different kind of spoons in the soup, so to speak, right? So I think when we look at adaptations as a general rule, I think it's exciting to be able to look at what those differences are and to think about what works on a page and what works on a screen, and how if you're translating between either one or the other, there's going to be different things that come into mind. And I know from an interview that Wakatsuki Houston gave after having kind of worked on this film, she mentioned that in addition to the different sorts of kind of network considerations that the entire group were making, one of the choices that she and her husband made when working on the script is that she wanted it to be a little bit more kind of overtly educational, because that sort of what is the word? That sort of subtlety can often be very difficult to convey in a kind of made-for-TV movie venue. So she wanted that to come through as powerfully as possible. Likely with the knowledge that high school students like me would be watching that and reading the book, and likely being asked to draw comparisons and being asked to think about the different ways that that story gets put together.
Cool, thanks. So I'm going to kind of go to the public question. The first one seems kind of easy. It's from Gordon. He's just wondering, is a transcript available? He's specifically thinking about the articulate recap and nudge to read Farewell to Manzanar again. So would you be able to provide a transcript or your notes or something that maybe we could send to this individual?
Yes, there is in fact a transcript, and I would be happy to make it public, especially for those who would like to return to specific pieces of the text or who prefer to see things as they are also hearing them, for sure. So yes, okay, so 100% happy to do that.
Cool. So maybe Gordon, if you want to email our the JAMP general information line or email address, then we could get you that aspect. Okay. So the next question we have is from Emily. Upon its publication, was there any major backlash to the book in regards to people who deny the JA incarceration as a whole?
You know, that is a good question. I'm not super familiar with the kind of reception history of people who are like angrily writing letters to the editor about things that certainly did not happen in the United States of America. I don't doubt that there were definitely letters out there that said things like that. I know a lot of the kind of critical reviews coming out were very positive. Also from the Japanese American community. I know in a public interview that you can find on YouTube, Wakatsuki Houston actually talks about how she found that a lot of the hang-ups were actually not about the content at all, but about kind of like, oh, like, it's so refreshing to see this history that my family lived through or that my cousin's family lived through being told. So I think that tended to be overwhelmingly the response that it received. But I also, without a doubt, am certain that there were those who ardently kind of disagreed that it was nonfiction.
Yeah. Well, yes. Okay. Moving on. We'll go to Julia Abo. How much of the book is autobiographical?
I think what's interesting about that question is that it was composed with this idea that it was going to be novelistic in form, right? So a lot of the content in the book is autobiographical. It is being drawn from the memory of both Wakatsuki Houston herself and family members that she was able to speak to and kind of fill in gaps that she either didn't have because she was fairly young at the time or because she had not physically been present at these events. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there are segments in the books that are written in italics that are not from Jeanne, the narrator's point of view, and are kind of based on recollections from family members who were elsewhere of events for which she was not present. So in terms of if there is a percentage of what is autobiographical and what is not, I think that gets into a sticky territory of like what counts as a fact versus a memory versus kind of an elaboration of that memory so that it can be kind of wended into a larger cohesive narrative. But I wouldn't approach this text and say trying to pick out like, well, which of these was fake. Like it's not going to be productive to say like which of these scenes is the faked moon landing. But it is something to keep in mind that it was written in order to have this kind of novelistic pull through the narrative, and that it was meant to tell a story versus being a series of anecdotes. Like Wakatsuki Houston's like, I didn't want to include every single story that every single person had told me or that I could remember, because then you end up losing that novelistic kind of narrative plot strain, right?
Yeah. Our next question is from Casey Furutani. They say, hi from Tokyo. I'm curious to know why novels about camp are so rare. As an Asian American lit scholar, do you see a future in JA fiction, especially stories about camp?
So I think thanks for that question. I would say that in this day and age, there are now just a wealth of really wonderful novels that we can draw on and indulge in with regard to Japanese American incarceration, and more being published all the time. I think if we're talking about the time period in which Farewell to Manzanar was first published, a lot of that can be chalked up to there kind of being this hesitation, both from kind of a traditional publishing side and from the Japanese American storytelling side, in telling this story. The World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was infamously not something the United States was interested in talking about, and would probably have been fairly happy to forget as a blip in history had it not been for the Japanese American community very fervently arguing against the dismissal of this history and the forgetting of it. And I think what we are beginning to see now is a lot of sansei and yonsei who are continuing to contend with this story and beginning to write it into fiction. For instance, people like Julie Otsuka, who wrote When the Emperor Was Divine, 2000 something, 2004 maybe.
Yeah.
Gino Ishii, who's actually Nisei and was incarcerated but recently published his novel Foxtrot Bebop, and any number of kind of recent novels that are coming out. So I wouldn't say they are rare, but I think historically it took a little bit of time both for the public to warm to the idea and for authors to be writing. We can look at things like John Okada's No No Boy as being an early publication that faced a lot of controversy from various different groups as the kind of story was beginning to come out, right?
So that kind of touches on another question that Ken Mochizuki kind of had. He said, has there been an equivalent to Farewell to Manzanar since? And he did, was wondering if Julie Otsuka's, When the Emperor Was Divine is something like that.
Interesting. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by equivalent. So equivalent in terms kind of maybe public impact. So I think it's difficult to draw equivalencies between these various different kind of works related to Japanese American incarceration, because they take on very different forms. Like one is a memoir, one is straight fiction. But I think in terms of work that is best known, we have not yet seen one that has become so as widely circulated as Farewell to Manzanar. But When the Emperor is Divine is also a very well-known text that is routinely taught both at the high school level and at the undergraduate level. And I think is super interesting because it is being written by a sensei who was not herself incarcerated and is also trying to piece through memories from her own family and also very specifically going into archives to continue that research. And I know there are a number of different kind of tidbits from The Emperor Was Divine where if you go into the archives, you know exactly what watercolor she was referencing or exactly what photograph or what kind of historical document she's drawing on and bringing into the book, which I think is really interesting and kind of perhaps sets the stage for another generation of Japanese American incarceration writing from generations who are reaching back into that past.
Yeah. So I guess following up on that, I'm going back to one of Ken Mochizuki's previous questions was Farewell to Manzanar a sanitized, acceptable version of the camps at the time?
A sanitized version of the camps. I think that is, again, one of those distinctions that's difficult to speak to in like any sort of kind of black, white, yes, no sense. I know I referred to a review from a reviewer who had written in Ghidra about how upset they'd been that Wakatsuki Houston hadn't been polemical enough in kind of her critique of the camps. And that might be an instance where someone felt that it had been a sanitized version that was meant to be super accessible. But at the same time, if you read this book, I think it's very difficult to say that Wakatsuki Houston was keeping things back intentionally. And if you read it with kind of care for the story in which you're reading, there is a lot that is very, very heavy and very intense about this narrative. And I think when you get into a discussion of what is sanitized and what isn't, it begins to feel for me very Hollywood in terms of like, is it R-rated enough? And I think that actually misses the point of what the incarceration experience was. The point is that it didn't have to be the worst possible thing you can imagine in order for it to have been wrong, for it to have been traumatic, and for that to continually, for that trauma to continually renew itself after generations, right? So I think really what the takeaway is that every person who experienced incarceration would experience it in a different way. Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston experienced it as an 8-year-old girl and also experienced it as the daughter of someone who was older and had a very different experience than her. And as we continually see more iterations of the story come out, more oral histories, more nonfiction, more fiction, we will continue to build up the kind of vast range of experiences that comprise the story of the incarceration.
Yeah, cool. That just kind of got me thinking about like, I work, with the National Park Service, and sometimes when we're doing the interpretive tours and trying to, talk things through about the themes and whatnot, sometimes people just want to immediately like judge it to other horrific events and then try to say, well, it's not as bad as XYZ, right? So I always try to tell them, and I feel like this is kind of maybe could potentially, pertain to this, where it's like, there's a baseline of bad. We've already like crossed that line. And so, try to get people to understand. But I can see how difficult it is, like, just when some folks view it as a sanitized version, but you also have to think about the time that it was written in as well. Because, when I think about like terminology and how much it evolved, since the 70s, and what academia, calls this experience now as an American concentration camp. Things, it could have been like maybe not pushing the envelope as far back then, but could still potentially been pushing it by just having it published in general. But I don't know. So another question is by Julia Abo. Do you have a bibliography of JA literature to share, general public and for teachers? So do you have anything? Or could you create one and then send it to me and then we could post it up someplace?
I do not have one that is pretty enough to share with the public, but I would be happy to make one pretty enough to share with the public. I have a working bibliography that I use for myself and for kind of your chicken scratch, like notes to self for teaching. But I would be happy to share a public pretty version with the Tadaima website.
Well, thank you for that. And then, we'll figure out the mechanism of sharing that afterwards. We have a question from Mia Russell. Do you think there is the possibility of future landmark works on the Japanese American incarceration, or is Farewell to Manzanar unique because of the time in which it was published and its early place in the historiography?
So I think that question is actually really interesting to me, because I was just rereading the foreword that Wakatsuki Houston had written for Farewell to Manzanar. And even at that time, she and her husband were being told, like, oh, that's an old issue. That's been talked to death. People have done research on that already. And it's not fresh enough that people would want to publish or read that. And at the time, their kind of rebuttal to that was like, well, we're not talking about an issue. We're talking about an experience that is very personal. But I think it's interesting to note that even in the early 70s, people are like, oh, Japanese American incarceration, we have checked that box. We've talked about that already. And I think we can see today that clearly we have not talked about it enough, because there have been significantly more poems and short stories and novels and academic books and oral histories and all number of really inventive and interesting projects related to this experience that certainly did not exist in 1971 when the issue was already done. And I think there is always different ways of approaching the narrative that we have not yet seen. And I think what I am most excited about right now is works that are beginning to probe more specifically or consider more at the forefront the relationship between the incarceration experience for Japanese Americans, as well as different sort of carceral moments throughout U.S. history, and very particularly the relationships that were forged and are yet to be built between Japanese Americans and the indigenous communities whose lands the camps are very much kind of located on and a part of.
We have a question from Emily Teraoka. Are there any stories, perspectives, or specific topics related to the World War II incarceration that are missing from Japanese American literature?
So I guess to piggyback off what I just said, I would love to see so many more engagements with the various indigenous communities that share kind of the history of these camps. And I would love to see that in any number of media, but particularly see that more in kind of literature, for instance, the poetry and fiction. And it's something that definitely comes up in various works. I'm thinking of like Hisaya Yamamoto's fiction from kind of earlier, as well as Mitsue Yamada's poetry, as well as kind of in a more contemporary sense, Brandon Shimoda's poetry, which was featured earlier in the Tadaima programming, and different sorts of works like that. And I think that is something that has been historically missing from a lot of our understanding of Japanese American incarceration and the literature, even as, for instance, publications like Kigija were already making those connections back in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, let's hope my voice is a little bit better. Is that better? Because I know we are having some technical issues. Yeah. No?
It's a little bit garbled on my end. I don't know what it sounds like to the public world.
I think I sound like Darth Vader according to Miko. I don't know how to adjust this because the next, I guess, couple questions are towards me. Let's see. So yeah, Melanie has, thank you both for your work. Hanako, what has it been like to do this presentation and to revisit your family story? So hopefully I eventually clear up, but it's been really interesting to kind of work on this project because, I try to not, I don't know how to say this without sounding weird, but I don't want to write off the coattails of my family. I wanted to make sure that I was able to establish a name for myself because, sometimes there are people out there that just name drops. But I really wanted to establish my preservation efforts and my background as a public historian. And I hopefully, I have been able to establish that because I know that there's been a few people who are like, oh, are you related? And then they're like, holy cow, how come I never knew this? Because I never try to out myself in that manner. But it's been kind of cool in a weird way because I know Kimiko is really excited for me to kind of, finally, I guess, kind of tell the world that I'm related because most of the time I just kept that to myself. But yeah, so that's basically it. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else has dealt with issues like this or not. But let's see. And then I guess the other question is from Sheila. What did your parents think about the book by the author of your same last name? Well, so I don't know about my dad, about how much he read the book or not. But again, this has always been like our family history. It's like, okay, you're of age, read your family history. Here it is. And but I do know that like most of my family actually had roles in Farewell to Manzanar. And so I don't know if Frank Abed is on the line watching this or not, but they were all the ones that are beating up Frank in that scene where they're beating up the JACLer. So that was my Uncle Woody, Uncle George, and my dad. And actually, the hardback cover of the book, or the cover of the hardback book, actually has a picture, and I don't know if Royce could put that up or not, but it has my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandmother, and then my Aunt Patty, Uncle George, and Uncle Woody on that cover with my Aunt Jeannie in the back. So, so it's been really interesting, yeah, just to sometimes see it in the bookstore, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird, but yeah, it's been kind of strange. But yeah, I don't know. But we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. I was gonna just say, oh, I guess Clement has something. Oh, Clement says something. You're an amazing person. I had never connected you to Jeannie until later. So yeah, again, I just didn't want to put it all out there. But yeah, so Mika, as we're closing out, is there anything that you want to add that you felt like you missed, or have any questions or anything as we close out?
I guess in reference to, I can't remember your name, but the person who was interested in looking for lists of Japanese American literature, as I prepare mine, a wonderful and indispensable source is Densho, where there are certainly kind of book recommendations and reviews, and I am positive that Brian Nia has put together a list of books that have related to Japanese American stories.
Okay, well, that's great. And apparently I might still have the Vader voice, so I think we should probably end this. Thank you so much, Mika. Really appreciate you doing this with me. And yeah, I hope you all had a good book club night. I hope you're going to participate in the Fine Artist Talk, or the Fine Arts Friday Talk That's happening in about 7 minutes. And then don't forget, we're having karaoke with Ponji and friends later tonight. So make sure that you sign up for that, and we'll see you in the chat.